Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into some really fascinating and frankly pretty wild source material.
Yeah, it centers around this event, a perceived widespread blackout back on April 28th, 2025, affected Spain, Portugal, and parts of southern France.
Right. And what makes this so different is, well, the sources aren't your usual news reports or anything like
Not
that.
at all. They offer a very unconventional perspective. It's described as coming from an investigative hypnosis session that focused specifically on this blackout.
So our mission today is to unpack what these particular sources claim, the perceived causes, the implications, both, the physical descriptions and these really unusual esoteric claims that are woven all through it.
Mm-hmm. And crucially, we also need to look at the kind of information we're dealing with here, given its origin.
Exactly. It's like exploring multiple layers of perceived reality all at once. So where do we start? The physical event itself.
Yeah, let's start there. The sources are quite specific about how the electricity behaved. It wasn't just off.
Right. They described it as contouring around the territories.
Yeah.
Spain, Portugal, southern France. Like it was actively avoiding them.
Exactly that, like a deviation.
Yeah.
The perception was of electric filaments, literally bypassing those countries.
Wow. So redirected, essentially.
That's the perception.
And did the sources offer, like, physical reasons for why this happened?
They mention a few things. There's this symbolic little red button idea, maybe representing some kind of shutdown command, and also a disruptive wave, maybe magnetic or vibratory, hitting computer systems, mechanical stuff, causing chaos. But the really key idea, the most striking one, is that this deviation, this redirection of energy, was perceived as voluntary.
Voluntary, you mean deliberate.
That's the claim presented, yes. And they also noted the electricity's oscillation, its rhythm, became unusual, even irrational. It lost its normal pattern.
Okay, so that's the physical description, which is already pretty strange. But then this is where the sources really take a turn, isn't it, into the metaphysical or esoteric side.
Absolutely, a huge shift. The perspective offered is that electricity isn't just physical power. It has its own esoteric vibration, its own frequency.
Right. And so the core esoteric claim follows from that.
Yeah.
That the energy wasn't just physically rerouted, but deliberately deviated using perhaps other non-physical means.
Precisely. That's the central esoteric idea here.
And where did it go, according to these sources?
It was perceived as being directed into this large, imposing technological, well, they call it a vessel or structure.
Vessel, like a ship,
Yeah.
but technological.
Yeah.
Okay. And why? What was the perceived point of feeding it all this energy?
That's where the sources get a little uncertain. About the vessel's own purpose, anyway. They suggest a perceived dual possibility.
Okay.
Either it was to feed or power the structure itself, or, interestingly, the purpose was simply to create chaos by removing the power from the region.
So creating chaos connects to another idea they presented, right? Another major esoteric cause.
Exactly.
Right.
Which was creating panic and fear vibrations within the population.
So the effect of the blackout, the fear, is seen as a primary goal in itself, not just a consequence.
That's the perception, yes. The sources explicitly link this to manipulating collective fears, drawing parallels maybe to pandemics or conflicts. It's presented as a way to, test populations on a massive scale, induce panic without widespread physical destruction.
Wow. So testing populations. And how does generating that panic supposedly help with interference or control? What's the mechanism described?
The claim is that fear and panic significantly reduce people's capacity for free will, for making independent choices.
Okay.
When people are in that state, they're perceived as being much more susceptible to external influence, maybe to accepting control measures they otherwise wouldn't. It creates an opening for what the sources just call interference.
Okay, interference. Now let's bring in another layer. The sources mention this idea of government awareness. That's pretty explosive.
It is. The claim is quite specific. It talks about people around a table perceived as government figures, or people connected to them who had apparently already discussed this exact possibility.
Discussed it as a possibility, or did they know it was actually going to happen?
The perception presented is strong. That they knew it would happen, some perceived it as planned outright, others more like a hypothesis they knew was credible and imminent.
And there's that really striking detail about their perceived reaction after it happened.
Yes. A sense of satisfaction, even malicious pleasure, among some figures, is how the source describes it.
Why? Because the plan worked.
Or,
Yeah, either seeing it as a plan functioning correctly, or maybe another successful test that reassured them about something.
And they connect this to geopolitics too, don't they? Like networks between politicians.
The perception is that these events have ramifications across borders within these networks of influence.
And the blackout could be used
Yeah.
as leverage, basically. An opportunity to push through difficult decisions, maybe things like new control measures because the population is panicked and fearful. Things that wouldn't fly in normal times might be accepted more easily then. Fear limits choices is the idea.
Okay. So, moving from government figures to the collective consciousness. What was the perceived effect there?
It's described as an electric shock, not necessarily creating new fear, but reawakening or nourishing existing ones, existing egregores.
Egregores, these collective thought forms, right? Egregores of what?
Panic and fear, specifically the ones perceived as lingering from past events, maybe pandemics, maybe periods of political tension or terror.
Yeah.
The sources say these were kind of dormant in latency.
And the blackout's specific vibration sort of woke them up.
That's the perception, stirred up these old fears. And this, according to the sources, creates a kind of vicious circle.
How so?
Well, the reawakened egregores then feed on the fresh fear the blackout generates in people.
Right.
And in turn, these energized egregores then diffuse that fear back out, subtly, insidiously, helping to maintain that background level of panic. It's presented as this self-sustaining loop.
Wow. And this fear isn't just an end goal itself, is it? The sources claim it creates, fertile ground for other influences?
Yes, they specifically mention perceived reptilians in this context.
Okay.
The perception is that this widespread panic creates an opportunity for them, for individual interference, a chance to implement their own schemes, maybe implants, for their own sustenance or system. They're described almost as eagerly awaiting events like this.
Right. Okay, let's circle back for a second to the energy deviation itself, the mechanics of it. You mentioned both physical and etheric elements.
Yes, the sources describe a kind of dual aspect. There was a perceived will to do it, the deliberate intention we talked about, but also simultaneously a dysfunction or emergency principle happening on the physical grid level.
So, they had to divert it physically to prevent something worse.
That's part of the claim, yeah. The idea presented is that if the system had just been left alone, something catastrophic and uncontrollable, like an explosion or implosion in certain areas, was imminent.
So the physical necessity and the deliberate action were intertwined.
Exactly. The sources describe technicians making physical deviations like rerouting power to prevent these explosions. But, and this is key, they perceive this physical action as being directly influenced, even orchestrated, by etheric or metaphysical forces.
How? What was the link?
The perception is of powerful energetic waves or vibrations being sent specifically to cause surcharge and dysfunction in physical components, like turbines.
Okay.
So this perceived etheric intervention had a dual purpose. 1, prevent the physical grid collapse, and 2, facilitate the capture of the diverted energy.
And the source of these waves and the place capturing the energy that goes back to the vessel.
Yes. It's perceived as originating from this etheric, large, highly advanced technological vessel soldier.
The same one, vessel soldier. Okay.
Yeah. Its function is described very specifically, storage of energy, and also the creation of dysfunction, specifically targeting electrical and electromagnetic energy vibrations.
And the sources even describe the occupants of this etheric vessel.
They did, which is quite detailed. Perceived as not from Earth, created by humanoids.
Humanoids? What do they look like?
The description is tall, very thin, long arms, wearing silver gray outfits. Faces are very thin, cold-looking, long blonde hair, and very bright blue or icy eyes.
And were these humanoids portrayed as the ones who meticulously planned the whole blackout?
It's described a bit differently. Less like a detailed step-by-step operational plan, more like they had a global connection to it, and they were ready. Ready for something they perceived as an evidence, something bound to happen anyway, maybe linked to the buildup of global fear energies.
Yeah.
The emphasis is more on an esoteric cause tied to human-generated fear rather than them micromanaging the grid failure itself.
Okay, I think I follow. So let's look ahead now. What did the sources perceive happening after the blackout? This is from the perspective of early May 2025.
Right. The perception was that some of those individuals who were satisfied with the blackout, they were already planning other similar events.
Similar events?
Yeah.
But not necessarily electrical blackouts again.
Correct. The sources mention possibilities like, say, gas shortages targeting specific regions, or maybe events focused on food scarcity, creating hunger, different types of panic triggers.
And how did they see people reacting to these potential future scares?
Kind of a split reaction for scene. One group reacts with immediate panic, hoarding, panic buying, extreme self-protection measures.
Okay, understandable, I guess.
But then they also perceived another group emerging. More conscious individuals focused on building autonomy, creating mutual aid networks, and importantly, making choices not driven by fear, developing the capacity to detach from the emotional reaction.
Interesting. And did they predict more events like this globally?
Yes. They mentioned Asia and Africa potentially seeing regular, maybe smaller scale occurrences. Europe might have more, but perhaps less significant than the first big one.
And North America?
The prediction there was for a potentially significant impact, specifically mentioning the U.S. The idea was that a major event there would have huge global consequences.
And all these different kinds of events, electrical, gas, food, are they seen as connected somehow?
Yes, that's a key part of the perception. They're linked to the same people or energies, described as a connivance.
The connivance.
Yeah, or like a continuous process. Testing and experimentation carried out on the global population using different fear triggers.
Okay, wow. So we've laid out this incredibly complex, layered narrative from that first source. You've got the physical deviation, the esoteric energy captured by this vessel, the perceived government links, the geopolitics, the fear agreeers being woken up, entity involvement, reptilians, humanoids, and then these future predictions. It's a lot.
It really is a very dramatic picture. But now we absolutely have to bring in that second source you shared, because it offers a fundamentally different perspective, not on the content of the Blackout claims, but on the source of those claims, the investigative hypnosis session itself.
Right, this is a crucial context. This second source basically sounds a major alarm bell about relying on information from single hypnosis sessions, like the one apparently used for the first source.
A major alarm bell is a good way to put it. Its core point is that information gathered this way is described as inherently highly contaminated and distorted.
Highly contaminated. How does it explain that contamination?
It argues the information has to pass through so many filters, different dimensions, maybe other consciousnesses, and critically, the subject's own mind, their beliefs, experiences, education, fears, everything. The source uses this great analogy, trying to communicate underwater between people speaking different languages. The original message just gets completely warped.
So, according to this second source, you can't trust a single session for finding out objective facts about the world.
That's precisely the argument. It says that information from one session shouldn't be seen as reliable instruction or solid data for investigating external events or third parties. The potential for distortion is just way too high.
So, if it's not for fact-finding about external reality, what is the value or purpose of a single session from this critical viewpoint?
Its legitimate use, according to the source, is primarily therapeutic. It's a vehicle, a tool, to get to the client's own issues. It's about exploring their internal world to find the root cause of their problems, their interferences. It's not designed as a reliable method for investigating, say, global conspiracies or the actions of unrelated entities.
That is a fundamentally different way of looking at it compared to how the first source presents its findings.
Completely different framework. And the second source actually goes further. It describes how reliable information might potentially be gathered in this field according to its perspective.
Okay. How, if single sessions are so contaminated?
Only, it claims, through analyzing vast numbers of sessions. We're talking thousands.
Thousands.
Yes. The idea is you'd have to meticulously sift through all that data, looking for the tiny, tiny fraction of information, maybe just 2 or 3%, that consistently appears across almost all of those thousands of sessions conducted with different people on similar topics.
So only the common threads that survive across a huge data set are seen as potentially reliable.
Potentially, yes. That's the only thing this source considers might point towards some kind of objective resonance. Anything else is likely distortion or individual experience.
And it also warns about asking about third parties.
Right.
Right, that it could even be manipulated.
Exactly. It cautions that if you try to investigate unrelated entities or events in a single session, other consciousnesses could potentially hijack the interaction and feed you manipulated information.
So investigation, in this context, according to Source 2, means huge, focused projects, not just one session asking about a blackout.
Right. Massive multi-session projects focused on very narrow questions with incredibly rigorous filtering of the data. It's a whole different ballgame from what the first source seems to represent.
Okay, so pulling this all together, we have this Absolutely extraordinary, multi-layered story from Source One about the 2025 blackout, the physical grid weirdness, the energy-sucking etheric vessel, the secret government knowledge, the awakened fear egregores, the reptilians and humanoids waiting in the wings, the predictions of more panic.
An incredibly detailed and dramatic narrative. And then you have Source 2, which doesn't directly say that story is false, but instead provides this very strong critique of the method used to get that story.
Right. It highlights the inherent unreliability, the high contamination level of info from a single hypnosis session, and contrasts it with this massive filtering process needed to maybe find a tiny shred of reliable common data.
So it's less about conflicting facts on the blackout itself and more about one source presenting a perceived narrative and another source offering a critical analysis of how trustworthy that type of narrative source might be in the first place.
Exactly. It really forces you, the listener, to think critically, not just about what you're hearing, especially when it's this far out, but how that information came to be and how much weight you can actually give it.
So the final thought for you to consider is this. Given the truly wild perceptions from the first source and the serious warnings about information reliability from the second, what does this deep dive really tell us about how we navigate these kinds of unconventional claims? How do we evaluate sources that operate so far outside the usual channels? What does it even mean to be well-informed when information comes packaged like this? Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.